Okay, so guys, we are just finished our Paula Meehan module, so we are going to talk through some of the ideas that come up in her poetry. And I mentioned in class the other day about her being from Dublin, and I want to just talk a little bit about the idea of the Dublin soundscape. The context that I spoke about it before was around the I suppose historical legacy that would have existed in the part of Dublin where she grew up, which would have been inner city Dublin, where she would have grown up with stories around the Dublin lockout, 1916, the Civil War, and just the general recruitment and activities around the Irish Volunteers, the IRA, etc. So her poetry kind of highlights that amid the permanence and poverty of her life, that she encountered the close, lively world of the tenements, and that is that area around inner city Dublin where lots of families live and work in a very close-knit community. And it has a rich oral tradition which has shaped a lot of her language and her imagery. And I think a lot of her language and her imagery is what really appeals to us as readers. She describes the world as a huge resource and a poetic headland, and I love that, the idea of her childhood being a poetic headland. She describes her childhood as being a sound map of Dublin city. There was lots of energy and bustle around her as a child. She was supported by stories, songs, the old people, legends. The area was steeped in Irish history, like I said before, the Rising, the ICA, the Rebels, the Lockout, Jim Larkin, etc., etc. So lots of stories and lore and folklore surrounds her childhood. But we can't talk about Paula Meehan and the poetry that we've looked at so far without talking about inequality. Whether we're talking about the inequality between the sexes, or whether we're talking about the inequality between those that have and those that have not. And her poetry is characterised by the backdrop of 1960s and 70s Ireland, which were very class bound. The life choices were massively affected by social and economic circumstances. Think about the teacher saying that you'll end up in the sewing factory. Those that were poorer had far fewer options than anyone else. In The Exact Moment I Became a Poet, she explores that drive to escape the shackles of poverty and class and how she could do that. Meehan uses her childhood experiences as a springboard to explore and often challenge inequality. A way of surviving in language, she says. She recognises the sacrifices made by her parents and her grandparents to ensure that she got an education, and she sought to repay that debt by taking poems into the community. And I mentioned in class before about how she said how poetry was essential, how it was needed, and if it wasn't needed it would have died off like our tales, as in human tales, TAILS. Alongside the poverty and unemployment of the 1980s, Meehan had to overcome strict gender roles, expectations and inequality. And those of you who study history around this period will be very familiar with the shackles or the boundaries that existed for women in general. And for women who were struggling financially, there were even more challenges and obstacles facing them in order to break out of those social roles or social boundaries. The importance of poetry to transcend gender and class is key to Meehan, and I've mentioned this before, how poetry is not this lofty art to her. It is this therapy, and she says that poetry should act as a therapy and a force for social change, and how by bringing language into the community, by bringing poetry into the community, she's drawing on all of these issues. So bringing all these issues out from the shadows and into the light. Social justice and society's injustices are central to many of her poems. Poetry gives a voice to the marginalised and to people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And again, if we're going to link with Meehan, that idea of bringing those who are marginalised, the outsiders, out from the shadows. She works to commemorate or honour those who died through poverty or the violent world of crime and drugs, all born out of a community of disadvantage. Her poetry highlights social injustices like poverty, hardship, disadvantage and emigration. She particularly focuses on the effect these have on women. The women in Cora Auntie, the mother in Hearth Lessons, and the women in the sewing factory. Women somehow bear the weight of the burden of disadvantage and hardship. And we can see that as we explore the experience of the pandemic, as we start to come out of it. And statistics have shown that women did bear the brunt of managing through the pandemic, how women were the childcare, they were the teachers, they were the homemakers, they were the chefs, they had to play so many roles, and certainly bore the brunt of having to I suppose maybe give up work. There were lots of different expectations that were placed on women once we found ourselves in a global pandemic. And it will be worth taking some time to look up some of those studies so you can bring some contextual experience to your analysis of me, and so you can talk about how you can take the current, the present, and inject it into a little bit of what Meehan was talking about from the past. We also discuss the idea of legacy and honour, and she ponders this in some of her poetry, especially my favourite one, Them Ducks Died for Ireland. And again, like even them ducks, that's bringing the language into the light and shaking up the idea of poetry, and that it doesn't have to be so formal and structured and stuffy, and it has to reflect the people. She explores the idea of what and who we honour and who we commemorate, and how does that impact on what we value as a society, and we discuss this at length in class. The satirical nature of the poem Them Ducks Died for Ireland highlights that attitude. And again, what about the women? Where are the women commemorated? And I heard on the radio recently about a discussion around the renaming of the airport, Dublin Airport, and I thought about, what about Markievicz Airport or Sheehy Skeffington Airport? And I immediately thought of all the women who have been silenced throughout history. And yet, the suggestions that were coming in were about Michael Collins Airport, James Joyce Airport. And even then, whether we're looking at history or the arts, it's the men whose voices are coming forward the most. And even though Meehan's poems are openly autobiographical, she clearly describes her own personal experience. But we can make that our experience. We can make that a universal reflection when we look at how we can relate to her experience in some way. And even if it is not the exact same experience Meehan talks about, there are elements of it that we can bring into our own experience. The poverty that she describes is not a unique experience. And while we don't have to have lived through it to understand it, because she makes it relatable, it's important for us to understand how her language is formed around that experience. Her poems are highly narrative, anecdotal, conversational, colloquial, all of those words, how she uses language to bring ideas to the fore. She frames large, looming social issues in childhood anecdotes, and through the use of vivid imagery and accessible metaphors, she makes the experience real and relatable for all, so we can all understand the experience of Meehan, and we can all in some way then find a way to make it relatable to ourselves.